is the Vice President of Saitama Medical University and Emeritus Professor of Kyoto University, President-elect of EPLA, who will take over EPLA presidency in the end of 2023. Professor Takeuchi will speak on efficacy and safety of OZORALIZUMAB, multivalent nanobody targeting TNF in rheumatoid arthritis, characteristics and rationale of new biologics. Professor Takeuchi has visited India in the past also twice. So welcome Professor Takeuchi, over to you to deliver your talk.
Express my sincere gratitude to Professor Danda and the organizers for inviting me to this Iracon 2022 in Indore. It is my great honor and pleasure to be here to share our research. When you look at the ACR20 response in y-axis, the 60% to 80% of the patients exhibited ACR20 response by biological agent in MTXIR. Particularly when you look at the anti-TNF, like infliximab on the left, next etanercept, TNF receptor inhibitor, and adalimumab, fully anti-TNF inhibitor, fully human anti-TNF inhibitor, exhibiting 50 to 60% response in ACR20. Given such data, please look at the new data from OZORALIZUMAB. What is difference and what is same from the pre-existing anti-TNF listed here. So in order to show the efficacy of new anti-TNF OZORALIZUMAB, this is the rationale, the factors determining the efficacy of given biological agent. First of all, it is very important. We are targeting the appropriate, such as TNF-5/6 receptor, abatacept targeting CD80-86, and rituximab CD20. And then, much more important than appropriate target, that is the trough concentration of given biological agent is exceeding the minimum efficacious concentration. This trough concentration is determined by amount of target molecules on the patient's body and the dose and the intervals of the biologicals you choose, and affinity of Fc receptor for clearing antibody, finally anti-biological biologics antibody, anti-drug antibody. Of course, adverse drug reaction and transfer to the site of inflammation is important too. So by considering the factors determining the efficacy of biological agent, we should look at the data in the clinical practice. Before going into the clinicals, again, we should remind in our mind that the blood trough levels of the biological redeemers, for example, in this yellow line, is showing the infliximab blood concentration. After infusion on the first day, suddenly after this infusion, the blood level is going up, then going down, up, down, up, down. When you look at the trough level at every 8 weeks intervals, the level is going down, approaching a minimum efficacious concentration. That is 1 microgram per ml in this line here. It is also same or similar for adalimumab as shown in this green line. The threshold is much higher compared to infliximab, still up and down here. This is also true for etanercept. Finally, when you look at this orange line here, this is the case for golimumab, newest anti-TNF, fully human anti-TNF. The level is much lower than infliximab, adalimumab, and etanercept. Still, this golimumab is efficacious for most of the patients because the minimum efficacious concentration for golimumab is much lower than infliximab, adalimumab, etanercept, right? 0.4 microgram per ml. But again, in case of golimumab, the level is going up and a little bit going down at the interval 4 weeks. So, given such data for pre-existing anti-TNF, what is the new anti-TNF OZORALIZUMAB? Before going to OZORALIZUMAB, the Dr. Carlos is already pointed out, we have a difficult to treat RA in our clinical practice. So when you look at the remission, low disease activity, MDA and HDA in the initial conventional synthetic DMARD, such as MTX, without no B and TS DMARDs, our remission rate is observed in 2/3. This is not bad, and then the target is failed. We should add the biological DMARD or target synthetic DMARD, the first line BTS DMARD in this case. Now more than 70% of the patients achieved remission. Again, the second line of BTS DMARD, around 70% of the patients achieved remission again. So the remission rate is good in this MTX, the second first line BTS DMARD, as well as the second line BTS DMARDs. However, when you look at this third or fourth and more biological DMARD or TS DMARD, the remission rate is becoming lower and lower again. This data shows you that after failure of 2 biological or TS DMARD, particularly 3 and 4 and more, the control of disease activity is becoming difficult right here. So this is highlighting difficult to treat away again. So what kind of biological DMARD used in this cohort? That is Keio University Hospital, the 2018 data. In this time, only tofacitinib is approved in Japan, so that the TS DMARD JAK inhibitor is the only data for tofacitinib in this time. Again, the first line BDMARD TS DMARD used in this case, in this cohort, 2/3 of the patients received anti-TNF. Around 20% use IL-6 receptor inhibitor, 10% is used abatacept. The second line, again, more than half of the patients received anti-TNF, followed by 1/3 of the patients received tocilizumab, sarilumab in this case. Particularly first and the second line BTS DMARD, more than 95% received biological DMARD, and most of them are used anti-TNF. What is the situation, the remission rate in the year 2018 compared to 2014 and 2011 in this Keio University Hospital cohort? The remission rate is actually going up from 2011 to 2018. Now more than 2/3 of the patients achieved remission by dust-to-minute remission or CDI remission here, even by Boolean remission, and more than half, around half of the patients achieved remission. However, on the other side round, 1/3 or even half of the patients did not achieve by such a treatment in Keio University Hospital, where 60% of the patients are used biological DMARD and TS DMARD, target synthetic DMARD, JAK inhibitors. So still there is a space here in order to improve the outcome of the patient's quality of life. But remission rate is increasing during 7 years at Keio University Hospital. Still, we need new agent. So this is a list of the structure of biological agent used for immune-mediated inflammatory diseases. Antibody molecule, the chimeric infliximab, humanized anti-IL-6 receptor tocilizumab, fully human antibody molecule is like adalimumab or golimumab. In addition to antibody molecule, there is an antibody fragment molecule like certolizumab pegol. Today, I'd like to show you the newest biological agent approved in Japan. That is anti-TNF fragment molecule. It is very unique because this fragment against TNF-alpha inhibitor, TNF-alpha is linked with anti-human serum albumin molecule in order to extend the half-life. So today I'd like to share with you about this new molecule on the clinical response. This is just news released from Rheumatoid Arthritis Digest, published in July 2022. This data is published November issue of Arthritis and Rheumatology this month. So what is the new anti-TNF? The origin of this molecule is coming from LAMA antibody. the human antibody is composed of heavy chain and light chain. However, in this camel, llama, the antibody itself is produced only by heavy chain, not using light chain at all. So it's technically easy to produce this heavy chain. By isolating antigen binding site called nanobody, including 3 CDC domain, CDR domains, this is called nanobody. By using 2 nanobody, chemically linked with nanobody against human serum albumin to extend half-life of this nanobody, the molecular weight is about 40 kilodalton. That is 1/4 or 1/3 from the usual general human IgG molecule. So the structure itself is easy to produce. That is easy to control the cost of the molecule. And then look at this molecule for bioactivity like ADCC and CDC. When you look at this infliximab as shown in green line, adalimumab as shown in red line, compared to this new molecule OZORALIZUMAB, no CDC at all, no ADCC at all compared to pre-existing infliximab, adalimumab, or even etanercept right here. The minimal ADCC and CDC activity was observed by this OZORALIZUMAB because of lacking FC portion of the molecule, as expected. However, the efficacy of this molecule is comparable between infliximab and this new anti-TNF OZORALIZUMAB. When you look at the efficacy of 3 mg per kilogram infliximab and 10 mg per kilogram infliximab, when you compare the efficacy in terms of the arthritis in this mouse model, human TNF transferred mouse model, OZORALIZUMAB 1 mg per kilogram, comparable to 3 mg per kilogram infliximab, and 3 mg new anti-TNF is comparable to 10 mg infliximab right here, showing the potential efficacy in controlling the synovitis, arthritis in human TNF transferred mice model. So what is the clinical data? This is the phase 2, phase 3 study in Japan for OZORALIZUMAB, new anti-TNF. What is same and what is different from pre-existing anti-TNF in this OZORALIZUMAB? This is first to report the new nanobody compounds anti-TNF. The name of trial is OZORA. This is the trial design. We recruited more than 500 patients active rheumatoid arthritis with inadequate response to MTX. The dose of MTX approved in Japan is lower than that in Western world, 6 to 16 mg per week. That is inadequate response definition to MTX. And then randomized to receive placebo, OZORALIZUMAB 30 and OZORALIZUMAB 80, 1 to 2 randomization. And then the primary endpoint is ACR 20 at week 16 and delta MTSS at week 24. What about the clinical data and what about the patient background? This is a little bit busy, but the age of RA patients enrolled is 54 to 55. BMI in Japan is lower than that from the Western world, only 23. And the dose of MTX is lower. However, it is very interesting to look at the use of biological agent in this cohort. Around 40% of the patients were already used biological agent, primarily anti-TNF here. And the duration of the disease is 6 to 8 years. The dose of MTX is 10 mg per week, the lower than that in the Western world. However, the disease activity is high in this patient population. When you look at the primary endpoint, ACR 20 at week 16, when you look at the placebo rate, a little bit higher, 37% of the patients achieved ACR 20 in placebo. However, OZORALIZUMAB 30 mg, the response is almost 80%. And OZORALIZUMAB 80 is showing 75%. ACR 50 is also more than 50%. ACR 70, 34% for OZORALIZUMAB 30. All are statistically significant. And then when you look at week 24, the response is maintained for ACR 20. ACR 50 response is going up. ACR 70 is going up again. So the data compared to the previous existing anti-TNF, they're excellent in terms of ACR 20, 50, 70%. Surprisingly, the response at week 1 for ACR 20 is already observed more than half of the patients compared to placebo right here. Very rapid onset of action in this OZORALIZUMAB. ACR 50 is already significant. And then ACR 70 is a little bit splitting after 8 weeks and 12 weeks, going up to 24 weeks. Particularly when you look at the change, ACR coefficient variable from baseline, the patient bus, physician global bus, tender joint and swollen joint count. In this clinical trials, we checked day 3 response. This is very rapid. And when you look at patient global assessment, physician's assessment, as well as tender joint, swollen joint, particularly patient global assessment, you can see the rapid response just 3 days after introduction of this new anti-TNF. When we consider the rapid response of patient bus, patient pain bus by JAK inhibitors, maybe by looking at this data, new anti-TNF, that is not from the mode of action of JAK inhibitor. But in this case, anti-TNF, the onset is very rapid, after 3 days. The remission rate at week 16 is also good. DAS28 CRP is more than half. DAS28 ESR 30%. SDI remission is observed around 20%. How about the progression of structural damage? In this cohort, the placebo did not increase a bit. As a result, there is no statistically significant change in TSS from baseline at week 24, unfortunately. However, when you look at the cumulative probability plot of change in MTSS, around 56% of the patients show no progression in placebo. In OZORALIZUMAB cohort, more than 70% of the patients exhibited no progression at all. This is statistically significant. So when you compare no progression rate in terms of joint destruction, that is 0 below 0 at week 24. The placebo group exhibited 56% for no progression, while the OZORALIZUMAB showed the 73% no progression. That is statistically significant. So this is a summary for safety through week 24 in this OZORALIZUMAB trial. Placebo 30 and 80. When you look at total adverse events, in placebo group 62.7%, and then 10% or 15% going up in this OZORALIZUMAB. 76.3 for 30 mg, 80 mg, 72.1%. And adverse event leading to this was observed in 80 mg, the higher dose group, that is caused by miliary TB and other serious infection, except this is comparable between group. However, AE leading to discontinuation is 2% higher for OZORALIZUMAB than placebo right here. This is also true for AE leading to suspension or a dose reduction. 2.7% for placebo, 5.3%, 7.1% OZORALIZUMAB, 30 and 80. When you look at this infestation, higher for OZORALIZUMAB, the serious infection, higher for OZORALIZUMAB, tuberculosis was observed in this 80 mg in fatal outcome. Herpes zoster is a little bit observed. Injection site reaction is not so high, like 2% for OZORALIZUMAB 30 and 1.3 for OZORALIZUMAB 80. As a totality of data for efficacy and safety, the Japanese regulatory authority approved this OZORALIZUMAB only in 30 mg, and because of some safety signal for higher dose like 80 mg of OZORALIZUMAB. When you consider the safety aspects of pre-existing anti-TNF approved in Japan, infliximab, etanercept, adalimumab, golimumab, ceftorizumab, and showing some signal for infection, particularly TB. That is also true in OZORALIZUMAB in this case. However, when you extend the use of OZORALIZUMAB up to week 52, in this case, 90% achieved ACR 20, more than 70% ACR 50, and more than 60% achieved ACR 70 for the patient who can tolerate and continue to use OZORALIZUMAB, as well as switched from placebo to OZORALIZUMAB 30 at week 24. The similar response, but numerically lower than continuous use of OZORALIZUMAB here. So this is the data for immunogenicity of this OZORALIZUMAB new molecule. The molecule itself is artificially engineered. As a result, the antibody was observed around 30%, 28% for 30 mg, 30%, this is wrong, 80 mg. And number of patients with neutralizing antibody, however, 1.3% for OZORALIZUMAB. That is not bad compared to pre-existing antibody, like golimumab, pre-human antibody. So finally, I would like to share with the blood level of this new anti-TNF OZORALIZUMAB. The minimum efficacious concentration of this molecule is 1 microgram per ml again. So when you look at the trough concentration of this molecule, it's 2 or 2.5 until 1 year. It means that the blood level, trough level of this new molecule is continuously higher than minimum efficacious concentration microgram per ml. So this new molecule is approved in September this year in Japan, and now we are waiting for the pricing of Japanese government for this molecule. We hope the price is coming down compared to a pre-existing anti-TNF, and because of the easy product of this OZORALIZUMAB. So this is my final slide. Thank you for your attention.
For time constraint, we just allow one question to Professor Takeuchi. Yeah, Dr. Chaturvedi, please.
Professor Takeuchi, excellent. Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Just one question, short because of the time constraint. What are the other methods to decrease the ADCC and so make it more efficacious for any anti-TNF? This thing. What are the other methods we can think in the future?
Yeah, thank you very much. When we compare the efficacy point of view, this molecule is better than adalimumab. Particularly, this molecule is sustained for the blood concentration, not going up and going down. And the trough level is far exceeding from the minimum efficacious concentration. If the price is affordable compared to adalimumab or adalimumab biosimilar, so maybe this is the very good candidate as the front line among anti-TNF.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Takeuchi, for such an excellent talk.
Thank you very much.
So we will move on to the last down under, and we will also leave the best to the last. And we have a very interesting topic, the living evidence in practice. How do we practice in a world full of evidence? How to filter through the evidence maze. So over to Dr. Samuel Whittle. He is a rheumatologist and epidemiologist from Queen Elizabeth Hospital, South Australia. He is the president-elect of Australian Rheumatology Association and he and Dr. Danda and he were trained together in Australia.
Okay, thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. It's a real honour to be here. I really want to thank all the organisers, particularly my old friend Devashish, who I've known for 2 decades, and I finally made it to India. So thank you, Devashish, and it's a real pleasure to be here. So I've been given the twin privilege of sharing a stage with all of these luminaries, a bit undeserved really, but also the responsibility of trying to land this session in a way that makes sense to you all. So bear with me, we're going to try and have a little bit of fun. So this is what I'm going to be talking about, living evidence. There we go. So, firstly, here are my disclosures. So, I do 2 jobs that I get paid for. I work as a public hospital rheumatologist half the time, and I work as a researcher the rest of the time. That's paid for by a fellowship from ANZMUSC, the Australia and New Zealand Musculoskeletal Clinical Trials Network, and also the Hospital Research Foundation. And then, to the perpetual mystification of my wife, I do all these other things that I don't get paid for. Some of this work's also paid for by the Australian Government via the Targeted Therapies Alliance. So this is where I'm from. This is a map of all of the Indigenous nations of Australia. And I come from Adelaide, which is in the south at the bottom there, which is part of the Kaurna nation of traditional owners of Australia. So this is Adelaide, world's most beautiful city. And you can see, there's a couple of features here. You can see that sorry, I'm using the wrong laser. That is the brand new Royal Adelaide Hospital, but that's not the exciting thing on this slide. That's the exciting thing, right? That, as many of you will recognise, is Adelaide Oval.
Yes.
Adelaide Oval is the finest cricket ground on the planet. And I was only there 2 weeks ago with my kids. So this was me going in to the semi-final of the T20 World Cup, India versus... And it was a pretty special night because I had been the previous week to the game that Australia had played in, and there was a sort of a dismal crowd. But this game, India versus England semi-final, the ground was packed, and we were all barracking for India. Partly because we love India, but mostly because we really wanted to see an India versus Pakistan final, and Pakistan had already made the final. So this was us going in, and you can see the level of support. And this is where I was sitting. This is literally the bay that I was sitting in, and it was full of Indian supporters, and the ground was wild for Indians. And it was such a special night, and I'm terribly disappointed that your team played so poorly and wasn't able to win. But we had a great night, and it was really special. So if you ever come to Australia, please come to Adelaide and come to a cricket game at Adelaide Oval. All right, on to the actual science. So this is the stuff that I've been working on for the last several years of my life. This is the Australian Living Guideline for the pharmacological management of inflammatory arthritis. And it's free to use on the web. You guys are welcome to access it and use it. You can just go to mskguidelines.org and you'll find it right there. I'm going to talk to you about a few of the features that we're trying to build into this living guideline. So I keep saying the word living guideline and living evidence, and I'm going to keep on saying it, so I better tell you what I mean by it, right? So what is living evidence and why do we need living evidence? Well, we know that we're being deluged by data. So we've known this for the last decade or so, that the rate of production of evidence is increasing exponentially. So it's long past the point where any of us can keep on top of it ourselves. So how do we deal with that? So here's another little Adelaide anecdote. This is from 1976, and very famously, a clairvoyant predicted that Adelaide, which is a coastal city, was going to be destroyed by a tsunami on the 19th of January 1976, and many people actually moved out of Adelaide. So this is Glenelg Beach on the coast, one of the city beaches in Adelaide, and that gentleman there was the Premier of South Australia at the time, Don Dunstan, and so he came down and stood on the foreshore and said he would hold back the waves, and indeed the tsunami didn't arrive. So he saved us all from a deadly tsunami. So how do we deal with the tsunami of evidence that's washing over us clinicians? Well, the tool that we've tended to use is systematic review. And systematic reviews are great. they're great enough, but I did a whole seminar on systematic reviews today. But there are some problems with systematic reviews. One of them is that we know that it takes ages for the primary data to get into the systematic review, 2 to 6 years on average. And we know that when the systematic reviews are published, that they go out of date really quickly. Half of them are out of date within 5 years. 7% of them are out of date on the day that they're published. So it's a good tool, but it's not a perfect tool. And I really like this joke. I don't know if you can read it, but it's the doctor is saying, you should start taking probiotics now before we discover that they don't make any difference. So we're always at risk of being behind in our understanding of the evidence. And the reason I like that joke is partly because it's funny, and partly because we just actually published a systematic review of probiotics for inflammatory arthritis, and they don't work. So, how can we improve on systematic reviews? Well, one of the ways that we're trying to do it is through this this living evidence ecosystem. So what is a living systematic review? It's really simple. A living systematic review is simply a standard systematic review, but it's continuously updated. So whenever new evidence arises, it is incorporated into the existing systematic review so that it's always up to date. So living systematic review methods are pretty straightforward. It's actually standard systematic review methodology, but at the outset you make decisions about how frequently you're going to survey the literature, typically monthly or at most 3 monthly, and how you're going to incorporate the new evidence in and how long you're going to keep it in living mode for. Because not everything needs to be in a living systematic review. The best topics for living evidence are those where we've got uncertainty about the effectiveness of interventions and where there's a lot of new evidence still being produced and when it's an important topic. And so this is the spinning wheel of living evidence. So essentially we're continuously feeding through the process of bringing in new evidence, appraising it, incorporating it, producing an output, and then continuing it in this everlasting cycle, which means that instead of getting this boom and bust pattern where we have a systematic review that's current and relevant, but then it dips off until somebody reboots it, we have it continuously up to date, so it's never out of date. That's the hypothesis. And it's a challenge to do this, and so it's required a lot of novelty in terms of the way that we perform things. And we've published on a number of innovations that we've incorporated into doing this. Some of them involve automation, including using machine learning, and some of it includes micro-tasks, breaking down things into tiny tasks, and actually crowdsourcing the labour to do that, which has actually been really successful. So that's living systematic reviews, but what about guidelines? So we can do living guidelines as well, and that's what we've been working on. But the first question that arises is, do we need any more guidelines? Do we need guidelines at all? So we know that guidelines are effective. There's good evidence that guidelines are effective, but we also know that they're probably not used in practice as much as we would prefer them to be. So before setting out on this task of creating Australia's first rheumatology guidelines and the world's first living rheumatology guidelines, we actually surveyed the members of the Australian Rheumatology Association to see whether or not this is something that they would want. So this is what we found. So we had quite a good response rate that was representative both in terms of gender, years of experience, and also from public and private practice. And one of the things that we did is we actually created a priority list of the questions that would be most important to users of an Australian rheumatology guideline. And you don't need to read all of those, but we're just about to publish this list. There are actually 34 questions ranked in order, but this is the top 10. And then we asked the respondents about whether they actually use guidelines. And it turns out that most Australian rheumatologists use guidelines, but not all the time. They use them sometimes. Very few use them never. And before we created our Australian guideline, these are the guidelines that Australians like to use. EULAR first, closely followed by ACR. And unfortunately, at the moment, and I say this as someone who's an author of one of the APLAR guidelines, APLAR didn't rank very highly, and that's something that we would seek to change. But this was the important one. Do people believe that they actually need an Australian guideline? And the majority actually said yes. So that gave us a lot of hope. But what we were most interested in is what are the barriers to use of a guideline? Because we didn't want to invest all of the time and effort and resources into constructing a brand new guideline if no one's actually going to use it. And so we asked people about barriers. And as you can see on the left, there's quite a number of barriers that were identified. And it's actually interesting, the bottom one in purple, which was the most common one, I don't need guidelines because I already know what I'm doing, is one of the great fallacies in medicine. Because if it were true that everybody knew exactly what they were doing, then we wouldn't see all the variation in care that we know that actually exists in the world. So we think that they're necessary. But essentially all of these barriers boil down to probably two main categories. One of them is something that I've termed techno-governance, and I'll explain what that means in a second. And the second one was the ability to apply guideline recommendations to the individual patient. So what do I mean by techno-governance? Well, these were some of the free text responses that we got that speak to this. And this is a concept that's been discussed in the literature, but essentially it's the idea that a lot of doctors don't like the introduction of an electronic or a guideline into the clinic room because it changes the dynamic from a doctor-patient dyad to having a third epistemological authority in the room. And that makes a lot of doctors and some patients uncomfortable that there's now three parties in the room and it's not quite clear who's in charge. And some doctors bristle at that. And what we say is you don't have to, it's there to help you, not to tell you what to do. So that's the techno-governance barrier. And the second one is this big barrier of applying this global advice to the individual patient. And so a lot of people worry about this idea that it's kind of a recipe for how to treat patients. You don't need the doctor, it's a cookbook medicine. And what we think is that in fact, a lot of guidelines probably contribute to this idea because they offer this illusion of certainty. They kind of tell you, hey, this is how you treat a patient, and go away and treat all of your patients and you'll be fine. Whereas we know that in practice, there's a huge amount of nuance in trying to decide exactly how to apply a particular recommendation to the patient in front of you. And that's the clinical expertise that is essential to clinical care. So how do we overcome these barriers and build a guideline that doesn't make people feel at risk of either cookbook medicine or techno-governance? Well, I'm about to show you how it's done. So here's my three-point plan on how to build a guideline that reduces barriers to use, is useful in the clinic room, and is an aid to the delivery of best practice care to our patients. So I apologise at 8:15 at night for introducing some ancient Greek, but here's some ancient Greek for you. So the first is this concept of phronesis. So phronesis is a concept that arises from Aristotle, and essentially it translates into practical wisdom. So phronesis is the particular skill of taking a general concept and applying it to the individual in a way that makes the most sense in the context of that individual's particular life, needs, preferences, and values. So we all do this every day. This is what we do as clinicians. But it's really important that a guideline actually acts to support phronesis, not to act in place of it. Because the ancient Greek term that's the opposite of phronesis is techne. And techne is just pure technical skills. It's a kind of orthopedic approach to life. But we, rheumatologists, we're the experts in phronesis, yeah. So the second one is around this concept of the tsunami of evidence that threatens to overwhelm us, and the idea of predigestion. So what do I mean by that? Well, we've spoken about the tsunami of evidence, but what we know from the literature is that when new evidence arises, the clinicians don't automatically trust it or incorporate it into their practice, but they actually need it to be validated through their peer network. So there's quite good evidence that this is the case. So people are very distrusting of new evidence that contradicts what they already know to be the case. And so what we really want to achieve in a guideline is, particularly a living guideline, is we want to be bringing in all of that new evidence in a way that's digestible and summarises the evidence for the clinician, but also validates it through a network of peers. And so that's what we do by having our guideline panel actually interpret those data in a way that's presented to the clinician. So that's pre-digestion. And the third concept is this one called mind lines. So mind lines is a concept that was developed about 2 decades ago. And this again is based on some qualitative work around how clinicians use guidelines. And what that showed is that clinicians don't generally use guidelines as guideline developers think that they're going to use them. What clinicians do actually in practice is they generate this thing called a mind line. And a mind line is a form of collective sense making. So they take new evidence on board, but they like to filter it through their immediate peer network and bring in other sources of knowledge in addition to the evidence. So the opinions of key opinion leaders, the opinions of their peers. This is what we do when we have our clinical meetings or we speak to our colleagues in the tea room, is that we try to interpret new knowledge in a way that fits our own practice and in our own individual context. And then it's a kind of mental shortcut of how to practice in a particular context. So we know that clinicians don't use the guidelines as written, but we hope that they will use them as a way to bring forth a best practice mind line. So this is what we're doing. We're hoping that our guidelines enhance people's mind lines. So this is what our living guideline looks like, and it contains a lot of information. It's all available at the point of care. So it contains the evidence. So you can see that we've got a summary of findings table. We present the recommendation itself, but you can click through and you can actually look at the evidence to decision framework that we use in the grade process to actually convert the evidence into a recommendation. Then the user can also look at the detailed rationale for how their peers interpreted that evidence and created the particular recommendation. So you can decide if you agree with the recommendation or not, and if you want more information on why it was created that way, it's all there for you. And then finally, there's some practical information that can be actually used to implement it in the clinic. So this is what it looks like. If you go to mskguidelines.org, you can see all of this. It's a really dynamic tool and it's free to use. And the other thing we incorporate, and we think this will help not just with mind lines, but also with the shared decision making in the clinic, is that we've incorporated these patient decision aids. So this interprets the evidence in a way that's digestible for the consumer, and these are also freely available on our website. So to summarise, what we're trying to create here in our living guideline environment are guidelines that take the questions that are most important to the end users, that are based on a best synthesis of all of the available evidence that's always up to date, that are accessible at the point of care and are usable as part of a shared decision-making environment, and then support the clinician's phronesis by trying to introduce nuance that avoids the illusion of certainty, by supporting living mind lines, and overall by promoting the shared understanding of medicine. So some of this work has been developed in conjunction with the Australian Living Evidence Consortium, and what we're trying to do via ALEC, the Living Evidence Consortium, is create best practice in living evidence. So that's our website there. And we're very proud that we've just produced this, which is the very first version of the Living Guidelines Handbook. This is also freely available via the Living Evidence website. So you're welcome to have a look at that if you're interested in living evidence. And that document itself is a living document, and so it will be continuously updated. And because I was last, I decided to finish 5 minutes early, so you can all thank me for that. Thank you so much again for having me. Thanks.